In 1686, Chinese cannons bombarded the Russian fortress of Albazin for several weeks. The Qing Emperor had sent an army to the frigid and inhospitable east of Siberia to capture the fortress and stop the expansion of the Tsardom of Russia in the region. But despite relentless bombardment, superior numbers and ferocious assaults, his troops still struggled to capture the fortress. This was not due to any fundamental inferiority of the Chinese forces to the Tsardom's troops. Instead, the trouble arose from the clash of Eastern siege methods with a Western-style star fortress with bastions. Chinese siege tactics differed significantly from those practiced in the West, which typically featured massive fortifications with bastions, systematic trench digging, and the use of heavy artillery. In this video, we'll investigate the reasons for these differences and examine how early modern Chinese siege warfare differed from that in Europe. Albazin is located in subarctic Siberia, in the valley of Amur or Heilong River, a narrow fertile zone in an otherwise hostile region. In the 17th century, it was part of the border area between China and the Russian Tsarist Empire, and it was fiercely contested. In 1672, the Tsarist Empire laid claim to Albazin, shortly thereafter converting it into a modern star fortress in the Italian style. That is, an artillery fortress with bastions. European engineers developed this type of fortress in the 15th and 16th centuries, in response to increasingly effective cannons that could easily penetrate medieval walls. This sparked a continuous back and forth between defensive strategies and methods of attack, ultimately giving rise to a very specific form of siege warfare. This method relied heavily on the capability of these new fortresses to withstand artillery bombardment and eliminate any blind spots, ensuring that attackers within range could be fired on from at least one position at all times. Taking such a fortress by storm was almost impossible. This forced siege armies to construct extensive trench systems, which allowed them to approach the fortress without being shot to pieces. This development reached its peak in the 17th century when a French engineer named Sébastien Le Prêtre de Vaumont perfected both the bastion system and the method of conquering a fortress. A well-organized and determined siege, using this standardized method, brought down every fortress. This development did not take place in China. Although black powder weapons had been used there since the 13th century, the heavy artillery commonly used in the West had never caught on. The exact reason for this remains unclear, but Tonio Andrade, an expert on all things China and gunpowder, suspects that it may stem from the variations in wall construction techniques in the Middle Ages. In Europe, walls were built thin and high until the 15th century, making them ill-equipped to resist heavy artillery fire. China, on the other hand, had built massive earthen ramparts since ancient times that were impervious to damage from cannons. As a result, there was simply no need for heavy siege artillery in China because it was useless against these walls. Because of this, in China, siege warfare developed in a completely different way. Walls played a crucial role from very early on, which is reflected in the fact that the main characters for city and wall are the same. In China, even small towns were surrounded by ramparts of such dimensions that European city walls appeared tiny and brittle in comparison. In the Longshan culture, around 3000 BC, some cities already had walls more than 10 meters thick, and by the time of the Ming dynasty, almost every important town had a massive rampart. These walls were not made of bricks and filled with stones and rubble, as in Europe, but rather consisted of tammed earth with a brick surface. They were actually pretty similar to those of later European bastion fortresses. Because they consisted mainly of earth, they absorbed the energy of heavy projectiles instead of shattering like medieval European walls. It was, therefore, almost impossible to breach them with cannons, which led to the Chinese using artillery, first catapults and later cannons, against buildings and people instead of walls. If you're going to visit these walls yourself, make sure you mentally prepare for spending quite a bit of time connecting to crappy and rather dodgy Wi-Fis. More often than not, you'll fail to connect to the Wi-Fi and will be forced to rely on your phone's internet data, which in a foreign country comes with really high roaming fees. This is a problem that today's sponsor Saily eSIM solves. Saily is an affordable eSIM plan available in over 150 countries, which makes sure you're always safely connected to the internet. Saily offers very reasonable prices, Depending on the country I travel to, I save about $35 to $45 for going for their 5GB plan instead of my local provider. Before you travel, you can easily choose your data plan on their website, download the app and activate your plan before you leave your country. With Saeli installed and activated, you're protected against accidentally connecting to a foreign internet provider, so you never end up having a really high bill when you return, because you use the internet in a foreign country. Saeli basically eliminates roaming fees, lets you avoid all sorts of scams because you don't have to rely on local SIM card sellers or connect to dodgy Wi-Fis. Saeli is compatible with iOS and Android devices, has a 24/7 chat support, and offers a full refund if your device, for some reason, is not compatible with an eSIM. Don't sleep on solving your internet problems while traveling, and go to saeli.com/SandRhoman and use code SandRhoman to get an exclusive 15% off your first purchase. It was not until the 16th century that European-style heavy artillery became widespread in China. This artillery type was called a red barbarian cannon, after the hair color of the Dutch and British who brought them. Thanks to the long development they had undergone in Europe, these cannons were now also effective against Chinese walls. However, it took some time for them to become widespread, and most importantly for the Chinese to learn how to use them against a Western artillery fortress with bastions. When Chinese officials imported cannons in the 17th century, they also became familiar with Western-style fortifications. This is well documented in military manuals, and there is even some evidence suggesting that some people, notably Ma Weicheng, in an effort to protect his home country, Zhejiang, experimented with the construction of Western-style star fortresses. However, in the 17th century, the Chinese still experienced serious difficulties when they had to attack Western fortresses, as the few existing examples show. One of these cases is the Siege of Albazin, an ideal case study to illustrate the challenges Chinese armies faced when attacking Western-style fortresses. Let's take a closer look. In 1672, the Tsardom of Russia officially laid claim to the fort Albazin. At that time, it was a sturdy wooden fortress surrounded by a small settlement with numerous farms, a village and a monastery. The Chinese emperor was not pleased with the Russian advance and decided on military intervention. In 1685, he sent one of his generals, Lang Tan, with an army of 3,000 men and a huge artillery train to eliminate the Russian outpost. After only a short bombardment, the fort was so badly damaged that the commander of the defenders, Alexei Tolbutsin, was forced to surrender. Lang Tan then razed the fortress and the surrounding settlement to the ground. But as soon as Lang Tan had retreated with his army, Tolbutsin returned to rebuild the fortress. Instructed by a Prussian soldier, whom the primary sources call Alphonsi Ivanovich Beighton, they built a massive Western-style artillery fortress with earthen ramparts and bastions. They reinforced the ramparts with roots of bushes and trees that were tightly woven together, which, according to one contemporary Dutch scholar, made them, quote, as hard as stone and unbreakable, end quote. Albazin became a far stronger fortress than it had been before. In July 1686, Lang Tan returned with 3,000 well-armed soldiers, dozens of ships with supplies, and a ton of artillery to complete his work. Once again, the Qing army was vastly superior to the defenders, who had only around 800 men and 11 large guns. However, after their arrival, the Qing found that the walls of the fortress compensated for much of this imbalance, as they did not have enough men to completely surround the fortress, even with some locally recruited auxiliaries. Nevertheless, Lang Tan gave the defenders an ultimatum: surrender Albazin without resistance, or be mercilessly wiped out. The siege proper began on the 18th of July 1686. Right from the start, it was evident that the Qing had no experience attacking such fortresses, as they did not build trenches to cover their approach, as a European army would have done. Instead, they built field fortifications from gabions, which were baskets filled with earth and rubble, and tried to take the fortress by storm several times. Because these assaults were all quite similar, we will only look at one example, which took place on the night of the 23rd of July 1686. On this night, Lang Tan directed the fortress to be attacked from two sides. His cannoneers opened a dense barrage from the north, while the infantry approached the fortress from the south and attempted to storm it. The defenders greeted them with a barrage that was reportedly so dense that both the town and the fighting men disappeared in the gunpowder smoke. Experiencing confusion and heavy losses, the Qing were forced to abandon the attack. The defenders seized the opportunity and immediately launched a counteroffensive. Their musketeers rushed forward to the enemy fortifications and pursued the fleeing Chinese, taking numerous prisoners and inflicting further casualties. This scheme of attack was repeated several times, as the artillery fortress made it easy for the defenders to repel direct assaults despite being outnumbered. In the end, Lang Tan's assaults were far more costly for the Chinese than the Russians. Unlike the Chinese, Western attackers would have dug 3 parallel trenches and connected them with what is referred to as seps, or zigzagging trenches. This would provide constant cover as they slowly advanced toward the fortress. Once they reached the moat, they would try to break through with heavy artillery or mines. The Qing, who were apparently unfamiliar with this method, now realized that their traditional approach of bombarding and assaulting was getting them nowhere. Lang Tan therefore tested various alternatives. First, he tried to weaken the walls from a distance by bombarding them for an entire night. As expected, this did little damage because the fortress walls were built to resist exactly this type of assault. When this approach fell short, the Qing commander tried to storm the southern defenses but failed once again, before finally resolving to build more advanced artillery positions along the river. Although his men succeeded in building several such positions, they didn't last long. The defenders shot one of them to pieces and blew up another one with a mine. Whenever the Qing completed a new position, it was destroyed by the Russians. This shows that Lang Tan had trouble finding good positions for his siege works, which was exactly the point of a star fortress. The bastions were designed to eliminate blind spots, so the defenders could fire at any position around the fortress at any time. When Lang Tan realized this, he came up with a new weapon to conquer the defenders: starvation. Putting his plan into action, the Qing built a network of moats and ramparts to surround the defenders, cutting them off from the river and thus their access to clean water. Albazin's men tried to prevent this, but they did not have the necessary capacity, so the Qing siege works grew relentlessly. Soon, several bulwarks made of huge gabions, each with room for 3 cannons, stood some 11 meters high, and a Qing fortress towered on an island in the river. As seen on this map from the early 18th century, which is based on the sketch of an eyewitness, and was also the model for our siege map, the Chinese now had more massive fortifications than Albazin itself. The blockade was hard on the defenders. They had no way to bring supplies or reinforcements into the city, and the winter came early and was harsh. This was a problem because the fortress had not been completely finished when the Qing attacked, and many soldiers had to live in makeshift huts or even covered pits in the ground. They had enough grain, but they quickly ran out of fresh food, and sanitary conditions deteriorated because they could not bury their excrement in the frozen ground. By the end of November, disease had decimated the defenders to such an extent that only around 150 of the original 800 men were left. Just a few weeks later, there were barely enough soldiers left in good health to man the guns. Nevertheless, Albazin did not surrender. The Qing fared only slightly better. Their camps were ill-suited for the harsh winter conditions, and they also ran out of supplies. This resulted in a staggering mortality rate, probably around 50%. Western sources even report that the defenders mocked them by sending them meat as a gift. Given the dire circumstances, Lang Tan decided to force a decision in December. When they were all set to launch a general assault, however, a messenger arrived from Beijing. He informed both sides that the Chinese Emperor and the Tsar Peter the Great were engaged in peace negotiations. As a result, the siege was paused and finally ended. Albazin was ceded to China in 1689 in the Treaty of Nerchinsk, which is considered the first arrangement between the Qing and a European state. In return, the Qing granted Russian trading privileges in the city of Nerchinsk, so in the end it was diplomacy that concluded the siege. Despite his best efforts, Lang Tan had not conquered the artillery fortress of Albazin. The difficulties encountered by the Chinese forces during the siege of Albazin show that although fortresses in the bastion system were known in China, they lacked the necessary means and methods to fight them effectively. This also became evident in the few other cases in which Chinese troops attacked Western fortresses. There too, they relied on direct bombardment, blockade and assault, all methods that were of limited use for attacking Western-style artillery fortresses. Interestingly, Western armies also experienced difficulties with Chinese fortresses. When the Dutch besieged a small town in Fujian province in 1662, for example, they found that their cannons were no match for the massive earthen walls, and instead, in true Chinese style, shot down the gates. Overall, we must note that very little is known about siege warfare in China in the last millennium, and one should not jump to conclusions. This is a wonderful example of how historiography is always in a state of flux. To date, only a fraction of the extensive sources of Chinese sieges has been explored. Historians who study this area will certainly have to expand, adapt, or potentially even completely revise their findings. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like, a comment, or having a look at our Patreon page. Videos like this require a lot of research, and every bit of support, no matter how small, is a huge help in enabling us to maintain this level of quality.